Hello and welcome to another episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. So, as you know, I am your host Adam Burns, and joining me once again via the telephone is Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you this evening? How are you doing?
I'm doing as great as I am, given the circumstances.
What sort of circumstances are we talking about? Is it other than the obvious?
Yeah, COVID-19 and stuff.
Oh, great. So first of all, guys, just want to talk to you a little bit about, basically what's been going on. So for those of you that would have followed this for the last couple of weeks, I've talked about incorporating a new series for then versus now. Now, the idea of this series is we're going to compare two drivers of different eras to find that we consider to be similar, and we decide and debate who we think is the better or who would win out of the two. Now, we wanted to kick off this series with an episode regarding Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton, arguably two of the greatest drivers of all time, who many people would consider the GOAT in their own right. Unfortunately, I did say that I was going to bring this up in this week's episode, but things have just been so difficult at the moment with a lot of projects and stuff going on outside of this. And in addition to this, I just feel like now is not the right time to bring out an episode like this, and the quality of it is not quite as good as I'd like it to be. So it will be out eventually. I'm thinking maybe when things improve a bit better and we're back underway, and we'll start this series off with a bang in the way that it deserves, in the way that you guys deserve for it to be that way. So do bear with us, and I do apologise. So it will be out soon. And I know, Courtney, you probably agree with me on this one. The last thing we want to do is put out something shoddy of this magnitude and delay it a little bit so that we can give it the best go that we can.
Well, that's right. We're hoping to sort of add this with a positive momentum going into what we're hoping is a start to a Formula 1 season.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that one. So we're just going to... Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, actually, I was milling up my lines here. So in this episode, we're just going to cover stuff that's going on in the news this week, and obviously discuss our current take on what's going on with the current COVID-19 situation and the hot topics in Formula 1 to go further forward. And obviously in next week's episode, which we're going to release on Easter Monday, as it's Easter this weekend, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. So in last week's episode, we talked a little bit about our experiences of going to an F1 Grand Prix live, which a lot of you guys seem to enjoy. So in this next week's episode, I should say, we're going to have a different feature where we're going to look back on some of the greatest cars in our opinions and based in history, and basically give it a once-over, a tech analysis on what we thought was amazing about these cars, what we liked about them, and what we felt made them so iconic. So that's going to be in next week's episode, and it's going to be a two-part. So the first part is going to be cars that Courtney himself has picked from a list, and the week after is going to be one from myself. So hope you guys can tune in for that one. And obviously, if you're new to the DNF1 F1 podcast, please like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's DNF1 F1 podcast, and also our social media handles as well. We have the Instagram page and Twitter page as DNF1_podcast, so please check those out as well. Let's talk about the news this week. So what's been going on in the news, Courtney? Well, first things first, as we would have talked about last week, we talked about the Concorde agreement negotiations that have been taking place in the background. I remember
it fondly.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So with the Concorde agreement, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, when we talked about it last week, it's basically to do with the contracted agreements between all the teams that compete in Formula 1, and they'll agree the terms, sign up for the conditions of them racing and stuff like budget caps and rules and regulations and all that other stuff, and they'll sign up for an agreement to race under those conditions for a certain allotted time. Now, the current Concorde agreement, I should say.
COVID is in the back of your mind. It's in the back of everyone's mind.
It's ever present at the moment. It's literally on everyone's minds at the moment.
Omnipresent. It's omnipresent.
Oh God, yeah.
There you go.
So yeah, the Concorde agreement negotiations for the current stipulations occurring between 2021 and 2025. So there was a lot of stuff going on in November last year where the teams were receiving their first copy of the Concorde Agreement that would enter into force between 2021 and 2025. Unfortunately, the outbreak of COVID-19 and the consequent economical crisis that is going to occur as a result of this have stopped those negotiations. One team principal had sent a letter saying that before any teams sign up for 5 years, we all need to know if we can survive this economic crisis, and obviously a health crisis too. There is currently no talk of this topic, and there are more important things that we need to do right now. All the teams want to have a clear view of what is going to be frozen in 2021 and what is not going to be frozen at all. And one of those issues was the budget cap that was mentioned. Now, originally, the budget cap was around $175 million. This is something that was agreed with the FIA and Formula One management, and they've been looking to try and reduce this budget cap even further, even as small to around 100 million, which was an option that Zach Brown, the head at McLaren, had suggested. And basically, this has not been agreed formally. One team in particular that opposed this was Ferrari. So there was a review for
Ferrari. It's always Ferrari.
Well, Ferrari, other teams had expressed dissatisfaction to this as well. I think Red Bull and Mercedes also were along the same lines as Ferrari.
The usual suspects.
Yeah, Ferrari wanted to consider, they didn't say flat out say no, they just wanted to consider something a bit more realistic. So $125 million was then put forward instead, which was still rejected by those three teams. However, and they wanted to try and reach a compromise. So 150 million was put forward by those teams, which the smaller teams in the FIA and FOM, Formula One management, said no, that's not going to happen. So what's been proposed, instead of the 150 or 125 million, is perhaps the option to raise this to around $130 million for the bigger teams. And it's a bit complicated, so I'm going to try and explain this in the simplest way that I can think of. But there was an algorithm or formula that the larger teams had proposed to the FIA and the FOM and the smaller teams as well, that the larger manufacturer teams, sort of Ferrari, Red Bull would be included in this equation, Mercedes, possibly Renault as well to a degree, but maybe not. They would be able to have a budget cap of around $130 million rather than 100, so that they can facilitate the operational cost in terms of building and manufacturing all of their own parts. See, the smaller teams don't necessarily do this. There's a lot of stuff that they do, a lot of parts that they build, but there are a lot of standard parts that they purchase that which are cheaper than it would cost them to manufacture them themselves, because they don't have the machinery or the capability to do this. So that's been put forward as an option, but that's still going to be reviewed. But at present, the current negotiations have stalled until after this crisis has been averted. So
understandable.
There's a lot going on at the moment in terms of the negotiations for the Concorde Agreement, and I'm sure this is a big deal, because I think we were talking about this earlier, Courtney, and I think Zach Brown's comments are very much at the focus of a lot of team principals' minds at the smaller teams. Williams, for example, are already suffering from this economic crisis. They've had to put their staff on furlough, the furlough pay, which for those of you
it's definitely furlough. Yeah.
Furlough, yeah. I called this furlong earlier. I was thinking of something else. I think I saw a story about the virtual Grand National and stuff, like, betting companies were doing that to raise money to support the NHS, and it just slipped in my mind. So I was calling it furlong ever since. But yes, so obviously for those who aren't familiar, the furlough scheme was a government scheme which other governments have done, not just the UK government, but to encourage businesses that can have their staff either work from home or not work at all and stay at home so they can stay safe, but receive 80% of their contracted pay, rather than try and run the risk of getting infected to go to work when they don't need to, just so that they can pay their bills and everything else. So it's a good scheme for businesses that need it, but it's affecting a lot of larger businesses. And I know we don't tend to think of Formula One teams as being separate businesses in the same way that football teams aren't necessarily considered as businesses. I know there's a few football clubs that have...
What fucking football club is?
Yes, we're not going to mention.
Big thing in the business.
Yeah,
Right?
we're not going to mention certain football clubs that have adopted this for the time being, for obvious reasons. Although it's very tempting for me, the team that I support, to actually talk about this, but it's not about bragging rights or anything like this. I think it's very easy for some people to look at a team like Williams and think of its name, its heritage, its history, and think, oh, how is this team struggling as a business to pay its staff? And the reality is that it may not necessarily be the case, but if it chooses to not follow this, not only does it put its staff at risk, but also from a business perspective, it may not be able to secure their jobs in the long term.
That's it.
Because we don't know how long this crisis is going to go on for.
That's what I'd be happy if I was told, you need to go on the furlough, but it means saving people's jobs, then obviously I'd be happy to do so. And we see drivers do it. Drivers have taken pay cuts and stuff, haven't they? I know the McLaren drivers have.
Yeah, that's right. So some have. Obviously, we don't know if everybody has done that. I'm sure in their own way they've been able to donate money. I mean, I'm not a fan of all this handing out of Premier League footballers, which seems to be the popular thing in crises like this, that we always seem to blame Premier League footballers or whichever country you're from, professional footballers that earn the big money, rather than, and a lot of people say that rather than do, the right thing, they just say, oh, they should take pay cuts. And I think, well, yeah, but not in the conventional sense, because if you're going to take a pay cut, all that does is lines up the pockets and of the owners, the rich billionaire owners that don't need to save money. I mean, I'm not going to get,
And also, the other important point that's being missed here is the amount of tax that they pay.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good point.
Forget.
Yeah, people forget about that. And, the amount of money that these guys pay in tax. Now, I know some people say, oh, well, maybe they have accountants and that in Panama or Virgin Islands or wherever you want to say. That's controversial to this, to say that not all their money goes towards HMRC in the UK. The reality is, with football clubs that pay their players through the PAYE system, the same way as I get paid for the system, or Courtney gets paid for the system, or most people get paid under the PAYE system, the tax gets taken out from that in advance. So the money that players may make that are tax exempt, or there's tax evasion schemes, legal tax evasion schemes, I should say, would be centered more around endorsement deals and sponsorships and marketing and everything else, not necessarily salaries, so that's a separate thing. But you're absolutely right. The amount of money that these guys pay in tax is incredible. And yet there are rich business owners, billionaire business owners, that don't pay anywhere near as much tax, for the reasons we've already just mentioned before. Now, we're not just suggesting that this is wrongdoing. It's a legal system, so they're entitled to do this, even if it's not morally or ethically the right thing to do, if you want to put it in a nutshell. And that really, there's, as long as it's by law, there's not much you can do about that. So I don't agree with this handing out of certain businesses and certain teams, sports teams, that are adopting this furlough system if they can not help it. If they need it to survive, fair enough. But some of the larger ones, as we talked about before, that we're not going to mention, that are doing this more for convenience, that's not good. I mean, we forget that Formula One teams don't generate anywhere near as much revenue. Even the larger teams, as your favourite large global football clubs, they trounce them in that regard. Yeah. So it's a different thing altogether. So Williams being the first one to really deal with these problems, I'm sure there may be a few others that may have similar issues. But of course, the longer this goes on, the more this budget cap may need to be reviewed for the future, because the last thing we want to do is end up with a grid in 2022 with about 5 teams on it.
No one wants to see that.
No. So, other things that's been included from the Concorde Agreement following that was the possibility of a token system. Now, the token development system, just in a nutshell, for those of you that would have remembered, with engine development in the current rules of Formula One, they have a token system where teams can only develop the engine develop the engine by a certain amount. So they have tokens that they would attribute to certain parts of the engine, i.e. the internal combustion engine, the energy recovery system, to name a few. and each time they would develop a certain part of that, they would use a token to spend on that, which could be for reliability, it could be for performance and other stuff like this. Obviously now they've gone away with that, and it's more towards you can only have a certain number of engine parts per season, so you can only introduce a new part a certain number of times. So what they want to do with this token system is that teams would have to have a certain number of tokens which they can spend as much as they like on certain parts of the car. So we're talking about aero pieces. I don't know if this restricts to engine, it may just be the aero bits, but obviously the larger the upgrade, where you may see a massive overhaul of the car, the more tokens they're going to spend. So, and the aim of this is to mitigate the bigger teams when everything, returns as normal, from spending a ridiculous amount of money on developing their parts, because they can do, to get an advantage on some of the smaller teams that aren't able to do this. Which I think is a good idea, it's sensible, and it will allow them to balance performances not only in the short term, but obviously with the new rules coming in place now at 2022, as far as we know, and those are frozen. Exactly. I mean, Red Bull proposed moving it to 2023 in light of the difficulties for some of the teams to have, and obviously there's the frozen development on the 2021 cars now, to the point where people that were developing the 2022 cars, I should say now, they're not going to be developing those right now. They want to freeze that. So, and this has been, in addition to this, the World Motorsport Council had also had an e-vote to ratify another decision, which was separate, which was to extend the current quarantine lockdown period, if you like, from 3 weeks to 5 weeks now. So instead of having a 21-day shutdown, which was originally put forward in exchange for summer break to allow more races to come in the summer, they've now extended that to 35 days or 5 weeks.
Do you reckon that they'll have to consider the fact that, given the trends of where it started, obviously it should usually finish first. So, for example, Italy's lockdown could well lift before the UK's, for example. So do you reckon, just for the sake of fairness, do you reckon they'd extend, the shut-off point to the point where all the teams are able to operate normally?
It's a very difficult one. I'm guessing they're making this decision based on the global picture. Of course, it's a very good point, actually, that you make that, because essentially what Courtney's saying, guys, is we have 9 teams currently with bases in the United Kingdom. The only one that doesn't have one based in the United Kingdom is Ferrari. And by that logic, if the FIA was to... and obviously, for example, other teams like Toro Rosso and Haas have bases in other countries, but they also have working bases in the UK where the majority of their works happen there. More so because of the convenience of logistics and travel. So, they have bases in the UK too. But what Courtney's saying effectively is, if the FIA decided to go by country to country in terms of managing its total lockdown or shutdown rules, what it would mean possibly is that if Italy's current curve of COVID-19 related illnesses and deaths decreases quicker than the UK's one, which at the moment it looks likely, given that they're a couple of weeks ahead of us in this pandemic, if you want to put a timescale to it, it's more than likely that Italy's going to return to normal working conditions faster than the UK will. I mean, in the news yesterday, the lockdown was lifted in Wuhan. I know they'd lifted it in certain elements and they've sort of integrated it slowly, but now they've completely lifted it under certain stipulations. So you'd almost feel it's a matter of time before that, hopefully that happens elsewhere. So it's a good point. I think, in short, the FIA are just looking at this on a global scale, and I think they're taking all of the advice from the World Health Organization, respective governments, for the European Union, of course, which affects all of the teams, even the British-based ones. Despite what's happened with Brexit, there's still that needs to be taken into consideration. I don't think they want to be caught with their pants pulled down again like they were in Australia. It was quite embarrassing.
No, that can't happen again. That was embarrassing.
Yeah, so I think Formula One management, the World Motorsport Council, the FIA, I think it has to be a conjoined decision between the lot of them. And the aim of this, moving forward, post-COVID-19, if you like, is to make sure that we have as much of a level playing field as possible. So it is a fair point you've brought. I don't think the FIA or anyone else would want a situation where Ferrari all of a sudden return back to work in conditions and start developing on their cars about a month or two before everyone else does, because that's not fair. I mean, I'm sure Ferrari fans would probably enjoy that, but no, of course, in this situation, it has to be about ensuring that it's a balance and everything, is fair and equal for everyone. Otherwise, what's the point of having a competition, really? You're just completely isolating the 9 other teams to benefit one. Knowing Ferrari, they probably won't be able...
You can imagine the angry letters that be getting written by the other teams.
Yeah, well, we've had a few of those letters already because of the engine issues that Ferrari have had. So, yeah, the last thing we'd want to do is have a repeat of that. So, so much going on. And obviously, in terms of race news, the Canadian Grand Prix, that's been postponed at the moment. So, that was scheduled to run on the 12th to 14th of June. I'd mentioned, I think a couple of weeks ago, that there was rumours that this one was going to be postponed as well, just like the French Grand Prix. And yeah, we've received official confirmation of this. I mean, there was a lot of talk in the news about the potential for some Grand Prix to host more than one event. And I think the Silverstone, the British Grand Prix, Stuart Pringle conducted an interview with the managing director of the Silverstone circuit, saying that there could be 2 rounds of the British Grand Prix with different layouts. So basically you'd have the one with the normal track layout, and then the second race would be a reverse race. So you just basically turn the cars around and then drive around in reverse, which doesn't sound like a bad idea. Sky actually released this interview, I should say, and they're not... It's quite extraordinary, but they're not really licensed to run the cars the other way round. But in extraordinary times...
We're seeing stranger things happen this year already. So.
Yeah, so it can't be put off the table. The only issue that there is that I can think with this, and the race did a really good video of this, so do check that out on their YouTube channel. One of their racing journalists, Scott Mitchell, he did a lap on the Formula 1 2019 game on a mod which allowed him to do a lap in reverse around Silverstone. And at certain intervals of the lap, he ended up going around the circuit as best as he could. And it wasn't bad. He's not a bad sim driver by the looks of it. Obviously, we'll talk about that in due course with the esports scene. But he basically did the lap and looked at certain points of the circuit where there are safety measures and barriers and, marker boards and all that stuff that would have to be moved around. So if you wanted to try and incorporate, say, 2 races in 2 weeks, then, or within a week of each other, it's going to be quite difficult to move all of that stuff around. I'm not saying it's not possible, I'm sure it is, but logistically speaking, a lot would have to be done. And I'm not just talking about markers and barriers and protection covers and everything else. I'm talking actual grandstands, because some of the grandstands that are in place in certain areas, behind the runoff areas, they're not going to be safe. I think coming out of Cops Corner, for example, you've got the grandstand there. There's literally 0 runoff area. So a car goes offline, like it might do the other way. It's got the runoff area, but if it goes offline the other side, it's just going to go onto the grass and straight in there. It's really unsafe. So it's things like that need to be taken into consideration in order for something like that to become a reality. So for me, I don't feel like that's something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Just keeping all their options open.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, another option is the Shanghai circuit. Now, the Chinese Grand Prix in Shanghai, that was the first race that was postponed indefinitely because of this COVID-19 outbreak, as it broke out first in China. And all of a sudden now, because, as we mentioned before, the lockdown has been lifted in Shanghai, although we'll see how that develops. In Wuhan, I should say, which was the original outbreak for the virus. So the Shanghai circuit, apparently, it's saying it will reopen in June. There was a source saying what was the source. Oh, it's actually the race as well. So quite a big source, actually. And they said that the actual Chinese Grand Prix circuit will reopen in June. And the same source also said that there were reports that the Porsche GT team had completed a private event at the Shanghai circuit with no public access, so nobody was there other than the people involved in the test. But it represents a first step towards normality And the first race of the GT Championship, the Chinese GT Championship, I should say, could take place on the 26th of June. So,
could you imagine even if they put that confirmed first race of the season, June so and so? It gives us something to look forward to, and that would be massive.
It does, and I know I don't want to be the bearer of bad news or be that skeptic, because I think you have to take these news stories and think to yourself, well, okay, that sounds great, but that was just a test with one team. It would have been limited personnel. So how do we incorporate all of the logistics involved in travelling? I mean, for a national GT championship is one thing, but we're talking about Formula One. We're talking about the travelling circus from around the world. Even if you tried having the event similar to how Bahrain was planned to be, with no fans, it was just going to be racing personnel only. That's a different battle altogether. But as you said, it's a good point. It does bring hope. It does show optimism that perhaps there is a bit of light at the end of the tunnel and there might be a way that could incorporate this. Okay, although I should say that the problem for Formula One in terms of incorporating the Chinese Grand Prix is that they wouldn't be able to have it in December as they originally talked about, because the temperatures in China in December would just be ridiculously low. So it would, it would kind of be like the Spanish Grand Prix. Sorry, not Spanish Grand Prix. It should be like the first test in Barcelona in 2018, where it was snowing for a couple of days. Was it 2018 or 2017? It was snowing first couple of days.
Oh, I can't say I know the answer to that one, mate.
Yeah, it was one of them where the first day or two it was just snowing. No, it was 2017. I remember because 2018 everyone was running except for Williams. So the first couple of days. So yeah, no, 2017 test. I remember it was snowy and icy, and you just couldn't do any running. Like people going out on wet tyres, but almost seemed like for a bit of fun, because it was like, how could you do any testing unless the whole
Formula One car in the snow, you don't really get to experience that much. So I suppose I wouldn't to give it a go.
No. So so there is some other good news. Obviously, we talked about the esports series last week, and we were a bit disappointed last week by this Challenge Lando Norris thing on the virtual F1 Grand Prix. I'm happy to say last weekend, I don't know if you watched it, Courtney, but it was a much, much better show. This week they got more drivers involved, a lot of the younger crop of drivers involved. So they had Charles Leclerc was involved for Ferrari. They had Alex Albon, George Russell, Nicholas Latifi was involved once again.
The Swedish fella looked quite handy, didn't he?
Who, sorry?
The Swedish fella.
Oh, what, Lundgaard's?
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, Lundgaard's very, very good driver in his own right. He's racing in F2 this season, so he's going to be a good driver to look out for. Very handy on the Formula One game. He was pole position in qualifying, and he probably would have given Charles Leclerc a good run for his money. Unfortunately, he had a grid penalty, which put him down the field. So he had more of a battle with Charles' younger brother, Arthur Leclerc, who's driving.
He's also pretty good.
Yeah, driving in junior categories, and is part of the Ferrari Drivers Academy. So you could imagine a scenario where possibly you could have an all Leclerc Ferrari team in the next couple of years. It's not out of the question, and apparently some people were saying Arthur is as quick, if not in some ways quicker than Charles was in junior category.
Apparently Charles said that himself.
Yeah, which is quite surprising, because if anyone like myself watch Charles Leclerc in junior Formula category, like F2 for example, will know that Charles was absolutely incredible in that junior category. It's a very big reason as to why he had this meteoric rise into Formula One and was in the Alfa Romeo team for one season and joined Ferrari the very next. So, you know, you see what Charles is capable of and what he's going to be capable of with his potential in the future. And to hear that Arthur...
He is a potential championship winner.
Absolutely, he's got everything in him. But then it was good to see the likes of George Russell as well. Did a very good job in the Williams, coming third in that race. And Alex Albon drove really well in the Red Bull. Obviously, we had Ben Stokes as well, the England cricketer. Sports personality of the year, I should say, for 2019. Very memorable moment for him was winning the World Cup in the T20 World Cup for England, and also the Ashes series, where single-handedly beat the Aussies in one test with an incredible innings when everything looked bleak. And that was kind of the highlight of the summer for us in Britain, really, that year.
Maybe we need Ben Stokes to save us from this coronavirus somehow. You've got to have a sticky situation against the Australians, I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, it might need a bit more than a cricket bat, but no. He wasn't too bad driving a Formula One car. I've got to say, on the game, yeah, he was in a very high class field, so you can't take too much off of him. But he held his own, and of course, lest we forget, Lando Norris once again, qualified, but then he disconnected. So Lando's done about as much running in that series as I have.
I'm going to ask you something, Adam.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know. Now, the problems that Lando Norris has, okay, is it the game or is it his computer?
I'm going to say it probably has something to do with his computer, because he's had this before.
Does he have it in iRacing? Because I've never known him to have the problem in iRacing videos. It only seems to be when he plays a Formula 1 game.
Yeah, I think the servers for Formula 1 games is a bit more sensitive, and for whatever reason, he just disconnects and goes out. So he was having, and it's funny, it wasn't just him, it was Esteban Gutierrez as well, who was the one of the Mercedes drivers with Stoffel Van Dorn, and he had the same problem. So in a weird way, they ended up having their own little head-to-head, ran Spa, whilst this was all going on Lando's stream. So they were doing that, and then you had Jenson Button, the 2009 Formula 1 World Champion. So it was a very high-class field, and we'd never had a Formula 1 World Champion competing in an esports race, and he hadn't driven the game long, and he picked it up, and he was fairly solid as well.
Yeah, he done really well.
Not as solid as Charles Leclerc was in particular, because Charles was fantastic considering he'd only played it for a little while. But it's great to see. It was much, much better. It's what we all wanted to see, and I'm hoping more Formula 1 drivers can get involved. We know that Max Verstappen isn't interested. He's more interested in doing iRacing, which is fair enough. You know, he
doesn't like the game, does he? He doesn't like the Formula 1 game.
No, he's not a fan of the handling model. Even though it's some people saying it's not bad, it's pretty good. But in terms of that, he said, he feels that he's not got the time to get up to speed with it or be as quick, so he's not interested, which is a shame, because I think someone like Max would really add a lot of value to it, especially with his esports pedigree being so high like Lando's is. You'd think it would be good, but then it goes to show that someone as good as Lando Norris on games like iRacing, for example, he's pretty good on the F1 game, but compared to drivers like Guan Yu Zhou or Charles Leclerc or Lundgaard, who'd only been driving it for as little as a week, you do have to put in the hours, and it shows in their pace. And Lando, you know, as enjoyable as he is to watch and as funny as the guy is with his wit and ability on the iRacing games, he obviously doesn't bring that to the Formula 1 games, probably because he doesn't drive them as much.
Well, that might be why Verstappen, because you got to remember how popular he is in his own country.
Yeah.
And he's considered, a potential championship contender for this season. He doesn't want to be seen as a joke. Maybe there is that. You got to remember, there's that risk factor to it.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's a weird one, because I know there is a competitive edge to it. Of course, the drivers are all having jokes with each other and want to drive really well. I mean, George Russell was only playing it for a little while, and he said he wanted to win, but he put the hours in, and he was very, very quick. Yeah. And it was good to see George competing in equal machinery, if you like, to some of the other guys. And of all the F1 rookies...
Williams up there.
Yeah, and of all the F1 rookies, he was by far the fastest out of all of them lot, with the exclusion of Charles Leclerc. But, so no, it was good to see George being more competitive. I mean, we've seen him in junior categories. I watched him in GP3 as it was then, Formula 2. He was so good in F2, class of the field there, and he's world championship material. But of course, we need to wait to see George compete in machinery that is going to be capable of winning races, or at least on par with the likes of Alex Albon and Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris. Those guys. Those are the guys that he's going to be competing with years to come, and Carlos Sainz too.
He'll potentially end up at Mercedes, I can imagine.
It seems destined. It's a case of when. I mean, it may happen next season. Of course, there are a lot of contracts that are up, and I think we should talk about certain contract situations in a future episode. Of course, there's so many drivers. I mean, the situation at Ferrari, there's literally potentially half the grid that could join the Ferrari team to replace Sebastian Vettel next season if Sebastian doesn't stay on. But we'll talk about that in a future episode. So this is interesting, Courtney. Guess what's happened? Guess what's come up on my phone as we're recording this?
I wouldn't know, because I can't see your phone, Adam.
Better that you can't anyway. So basically, it's kind of had a Jim White moment here. If anyone's familiar with Sky Sports, it's just come from a phone like breaking news from the Formula 1 app. And it's saying that according to Ross Brawn, they just had an interview, the 2020 F1 season likely to start in Europe, and it could be behind closed doors. So that's interesting. I mean, we were just talking about obviously what was going on in Shanghai, where they had that test session behind closed doors. And now this story's come up just quite conveniently. And it's funny because when we normally record these episodes on a Monday night, as per norm, the timetable's gone a bit all over the place at the moment. It's funny how we talk about certain stories and then big scoops or big stories tend to come up just after I've finished editing. So I'm sitting there shaking my head going, what the hell is going on? Screaming like, oh damn it, like why didn't we record it later?
Being trolled.
That's it, I think they're doing it. This time, haha, we've gone on top of it. They haven't caught us out this time, so good. We've got one over on them. So in this story it says, I'm just going to read it through, guys, so bear with us on this. It says, Ross Brawn says the 2020 season will likely begin in Europe, potentially behind closed doors, so similar to what they talked about in Bahrain, when it eventually gets underway after the coronavirus pandemic delay has sort of subsided a little bit. It says on Tuesday, the Canadian Grand Prix became the latest race to be postponed because of the virus, the 9th race to be postponed or cancelled. Really, 9 races? Jeez, that's a lot. F1 bosses are working with promoters to create a revised calendar for a time when it's possible to once again go for racing. Brawn said it was Formula 1's desire to go racing as soon as possible, if anything to give fans some entertainment in difficult times, even if that means holding some of the initial events without fans. Just scrolling down. And there goes my laptop saying I need to... Oh no, it's my OneDrive saying I need to take some stuff off of there.
Wow. Damn, son.
My laptop is clean. It's full of memes.
Yeah, what, mate? Whatever.
It's full of memes. And pictures of F1 cars. Yeah. Anyway, so closed door race is possible. Don't know why I said that earlier. Never mind. Anyway, travel for the teams and travel for everyone involved is going to be one of the big issues, said Brawn, who was speaking to Sky Sports. Well, obviously, logistics was always going to be a key factor in this. You could argue once we get there, we could become fairly self-contained. So, I mean, that seems to me that they're going to try and incorporate races in Europe so that there's not too much air travel. It's mostly just going to be driving from border to border, which I suppose is safer. And it's easier to get more races done. Of course, if Ross Brawn wants to incorporate race weekends happening simultaneously or sequentially one after the other without any major breaks, then this is probably doable. I mean, he goes on to say, our view is probably a European start will be favourable, and that could even be a closed event. We could have a very enclosed environment where teams come in on charters, we channel them into the circuit, we make sure everyone is tested, cleared, and that there is no risk to anyone. So, I mean, he goes on to say, we have a race with no spectators. That's not great, but it's better than no racing at all. We have to remember there are millions of people who follow the sport that are sat at home, like me, and Courtney, of course. A lot of them are isolating, and so to be able to keep the sport alive and put on a sport and entertain people will be a huge bonus in this crisis we have, but we can't put anyone at risk. We're looking at organised...
And also, on a personal note, I'm paying a Sky package for this Formula 1 channel. I'm not even watching any bloody racing.
Yeah, that's the thing. A lot of people that obviously... I had a mate of mine ask me about this because he wanted to get a Now TV subscription for an annual pass for Formula 1. Yeah. Obviously, you can't do this pro rata. You have to get an annual pass for it. And unfortunately, he was asking me, should I get it? And I said, to be honest, mate, I wouldn't bother yet because I feel like a lot of the... And this was back in... this was back before the Australian Grand Prix, the week before. Because I thought that the race was going to get cancelled. And obviously what happened. And now we're in a position where as many as 9 races has been postponed. That's almost half a season. Which is ridiculous. I mean, in the older days, if 9 races got postponed, you wouldn't be able to finish a season, like by the rules stating that 8 races have to be completed at a minimum. But so it is a big thing. Like you said, a lot of people watch this on television. The UK is one of the biggest audiences in the world. The German audience, I think, is the largest TV-based audience in the world. And what's to mention, there aren't really many countries left that have free-to-air Formula 1 television anymore. I think almost 95% of them are subscription-based services.
Yeah.
Like Sky, for example, which is a big problem for the for Formula One if you don't have any races. So I see the motivation for it. Of course, Ross Brawn is saying measures to make sure everyone is tested, make sure people are protective. It's a very difficult thing to manage, considering what they tried to achieve in Australia with this social distancing to the drivers and all the other stuff, and then they still ended up having people being infected.
But couldn't they do a incubation period? Like, I'm no scientist, but couldn't they do an incubation period of 2 to 3 weeks before they fly off, or not fly off, get started on the season?
It's possible. I mean, the McLaren mechanics, and that thankfully, that had the virus, thankfully they are okay and they were able to return. So that was good. I mean, as I said, a lot of people have died from this already. So it's something that back then we probably didn't take it as seriously. Oops, sorry, that was my phone. Sorry, my phone there telling me that my battery's running out on that. So if you heard that and wondered what that was, don't worry. Bit weird. Never heard that sound from my phone before. Anyway, so thankfully those mechanics were able to return to work again, but it's something that we haven't taken seriously enough, and this is why we ended up in the position that we're in with Formula One, where they tried to have the Australian Grand Prix go ahead and have egg on their face. So it's a very sensitive situation that, yes, it's possible to have this period of incubation where people can sort of be monitored and looked after so that it's safe. But I still think there are going to be the challenges, logistically speaking, of being able to move people from one country to another, depending on where the race is going to be in Europe. And if you like, contain this Formula One circus, isolate it away from the rest of the world. I mean, I know we joke about the F1 world coexisting with the real life world as if it's two separate entities, but in this scenario, it isn't possible to exist in that manner.
Nah.
So, to me, it's an interesting story, and it does bring some hope that perhaps we're at a point now where certain countries like Italy and France, or Italy in particular, have reached their peak, and they're now starting to see a decline in people getting infected and people dying. Obviously, the lockdown got lifted in Wuhan, China, which is, so it's good news, but there's lots of things still happening in the UK where it's unprecedented. Of course, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been treated in intensive care owing this, although thankfully he's okay by the sound of it and responding well, so that's good. So hopefully he gets better soon, on top of everyone else who's falling sick from or dying from this worse. So we really have to be careful that we're not repeating mistakes just for the sake of having an F1 race or a championship. I know we want to get things underway and we want to entertain people, but at times like this, what we're dealing with at the moment, we have to maintain that if there's no significant improvement in the situation. We don't want to risk we don't want to risk moving things back just to facilitate having a sport. We don't want to go backwards on this. We've made progress.
Health comes first.
Yeah, health comes first, absolutely. And I think that's paramount in what we believe as fans of the sport. As much as we miss it and as much as we want it to come back straight away, we know that there are things more important than this. But I'm sure Ross Brawn wouldn't be saying this. I mean, he's an incredibly intelligent man and he's done a lot of good things for Formula One. He's doing really a great deal for the sport. And his number one interest is the fans and the people involved in the sport, and the health of people involved in the sport. That's always going to come first. So I know he's probably saying this with a plan in place or ideas where they can facilitate this or maybe make it work. But of course, it's under the assumption that things will start to improve a bit more around the world with this COVID-19 situation, or at least in a way where it can be contained until either a vaccine is found or we can sort of return to normal in some capacity. I think that's probably a good time to wrap this episode up. So a bit of a shorter one than we normally would do, but given the current situation, there's not a massive amount to talk about. I'm sure you guys will appreciate that. So in the next episode, as we talked about earlier, we're going to have our 2 parts on some of our favourite F1 cars of all time. And some of the cars we consider to be icons or the greatest in our minds of different generations and different decades. And next week's is going to be Courtney's list. So we hope to see you then. Stay safe, look after yourself, and we'll catch you on the next DNF1 F1 podcast.
See you soon.
See you later.